I'm making another album, and today I'm going to talk about something which is following on from the mailbag episode last time, where me and Joni came to the conclusion that what AI music generators mean for artists, tools like Suno, which are making, quite frankly, incredible quality to a certain extent, music in a certain way automatically within seconds. What that type of technology means for artists is that we need to do more of what I've been talking about for years, which is making unique music, developing our unique voice. And the reason that I'm talking about this on the album podcast and not any of the other podcasts is because, from my experience, the very best way to develop your unique style is to finish music. And the best way to finish music, that I've found anyway, is to think of your music in terms of albums, whether you're going to release the music as albums or not, because there is a specific deadline, a specific milestone that you are working towards, which means that you have an endpoint. Because one of the problems with making unique music is that it is a discovery process. It's an ongoing discovery process that if it has no end, even if that end is somewhat artificial in that you're saying, okay, I'm going to finish an album by this point, if you don't have that kind of a milestone, your experimentation can be very aimless and not go anywhere, and you just end up going around in circles. Because one of the mistakes a lot of people make when making unique music or trying to make unique music is that, number one, they think they can do it in their own heads. So they come up with a musical vision in their own heads of what they want, and then they get very frustrated when they try and make it happen and it doesn't happen immediately. And the other mistake that they make is they think that making unique music is a result, it's a goal, when in fact it's a process. And I think the distinction I would make between an artist, someone who is constantly making unique music, constantly developing themselves, and a craftist, someone who is making different versions of what has already existed, somebody who works within a genre largely, is that an artist is constantly iterating and moving forward and developing their sound. What they did yesterday isn't what they're going to do tomorrow. It may well be informed by what they did yesterday because it's the next step, but it's much more of a process. But of course, in order for it not to turn into aimless wanderings, we need to put a constraint on it. We need to say this is finished. And that's where making albums come in. In fact, what I've done is I've made a playlist of previous Mondayland episodes that I'm going to refer to today, because aside from the mailbag episode from last week, which I'll put in this playlist, I'm also putting the first ever episode of this podcast, the album, where I talk about my reasons for making an album. And you will notice that a third or maybe even a half of that episode is me talking about finding my unique style. And what I'm going to do over the next week is focus everything that I make, podcasts, emails, blog posts, on this area of making unique music. Because I believe, having now checked in with the AI music generators, I got really into it a couple of years ago. And the question last week led me to check out AI music again. And it was quite frankly shocking how much it's come on. Now that is happening. What was predicted is actually happening already. What I believe was always crucial for an artist, developing, finding your unique voice, is now urgent. Because if a piece of technology in minutes can make a piece of music within a genre that is as good as, or even approaching as good as, what you can make after many years of improvement and skill and growth, then what we have to do, what we are forced to do, what we must do, is do something that AI music generators can't, which is make something that doesn't sound like anything else, although it can be influenced by other things. So make something that doesn't sound like anything else, for a purpose which we choose. And after checking Suno out myself, what I immediately did, of course, was introduce it to my kids because I knew they'd enjoy it. And obviously, the very first thing they started doing was making pieces of music about how their brothers were poopy heads. And essentially, one thing that I can confirm AI music generators are great for is making songs about poo. So, because there's been a lot of that made over the last couple of weeks. But also what was interesting, the other thing they immediately attempted to do, aside from my brother is a poopy pants and things like that, the other thing they immediately tried to do was make music that sounded like their favorite artists. And what was super interesting is that there were certain artists that they could do that with, and then there were other artists that they couldn't do that with. So in other words, there are some artists out there whose music can be reproduced now by AI music generators, and there are other artists whose music cannot be reproduced by AI music generators. And bear in mind, this is without referring to the artists. So with Suno, you aren't allowed to, as far as I know anyway, you aren't allowed to mention an artist's name when you're asking for the music. You have to talk in generic terms. So I couldn't say, make a track like Sampha, for instance. I would have to say, and this is the interesting thing, one of my boys, Harry, loves Sampha, absolutely loves Sampha. And actually, he finds it very difficult to find other music he loves as much because Sampha is one of those artists who's incredibly unique. It's not just his voice as well, even though he has got an incredibly unique literal voice, singing voice. His music as well is incredibly unique. How do you, without referring to the word Sampha, how would you explain to that AI, make music like that? It's essentially impossible. The same would be true of Burial, for instance. The same might be true of Four Tet, Frank Ocean, Radiohead, 10,000 Gex, Bleachers, Fever Ray, Wiseblood, Julie Byrne, Tank and the Bangers, Billie Eilish, but interestingly probably not Phineas when he's making his own music. All of these artists, it would be extremely hard for you to ask an AI to make their music, to make music that sounded like them without reference to their name. Whereas there are other artists, and I'm not going to mention who they are because I don't like calling out people in a negative sense. I don't think that serves anybody. But there are other artists, I'm sure that you can think of, who their music can be produced by AI music generators. Not specifically their music, not specific tracks, but music that sounds pretty much the same as. Now, bear in mind, this doesn't mean that their music, the people whose music can be produced by AI music generators, is bad necessarily. It's just not unique. It's simply generic. And the skill involved in writing generic music is often equal to the skill involved in making unique music. In fact, the people, not always, but quite often, the people who make unique music are, in a sense, often in a technical sense, less skilled than those who are making generic music. Why is that? Because when you're making generic music, the only vertical, if you like, you have to compete on is how technically good it is. Maybe not the only vertical, but one of the main verticals. Whereas when you're making something that's unique and good, there's a lot of other things that come into it. It's not just about the how, it's about the why and the what. So in other words, a way of thinking about this is that if you're focused on how to do something and how technical it is and how skilled you are at the specific technical thing, then you're likely to be, again, it's not 100% the case, but you're likely to be towards the craftist side of things. Whereas when that becomes less important, when your technical ability becomes less important, then you tend to be on the artist side of things. Now, that's not to say that people who are artists are not technically proficient or in some cases brilliant. Like Sampha is a great singer, Burial is a great producer. Frank Ocean is a great singer. Billie Eilish is a fantastic singer. In those cases, it's not just the technical proficiency that creates the value. That's not the only place that the quality resides, if you like. It's also in that nobody else sounds like them. They have this thing that only they do. And because of that, their value is much higher. So not only is it technically great, in fact, it being technically great is somewhat optional. I mean, it is true as well, but it's somewhat optional. It's also that they are doing something that nobody else can do and does. So let's have a think about what unique music is exactly. What makes unique music? And I always ask a question of people when we're talking about this. I always start with a question. So I'm going to ask you this question. What's the difference between a genre and a style? Have a think about it. What is the difference between a genre and a style? Well, essentially, a genre and a style are, in fact, examples of the same thing. And that thing is a category. So a category is a weird thing that we have that means that we can say that certain elements or certain ingredients in this thing are in this category. So in other words, if I say, what is a table to you? There are certain things that are more required for it to be a table and less required for it to be a table. So you might say 4 legs. Well, I'm right now looking at a table with 1 leg. So it's not that every table has 4 legs. Right? The other thing is that there are other things that have 4 legs. Like a giraffe has 4 legs. A giraffe is not a table, right? So you could then also say, well, a table is also something that you put things on. The thing is, I'm right now looking at a synthesizer that has a piece of paper on top of it. Is that a table? I mean, I may well be using it as a table, but it isn't a table, right? So actually, when you get down to it, describing what a table is becomes quite hard just based upon its elements. So in other words, how we know something is in a category is flexible. And there are certain things which are more archetypal of that category, certain elements of that category. So for instance, a table is something you put things on, I would say is more archetypal, is more in the center of the bullseye for a table than 4 legs. And arguably, I could say that it's made of wood is even less in the center of the bullseye than 4 legs for a table. I mean, we could argue about that, but essentially there are certain features of any given category that when put together make us perceive that thing as being in that category. And there are other features which are less important, but which still are relevant. So I'm looking at a table right now. It's got things on it. It's got 1 leg. It can go up and down, and it's got wheels. Now the wheels thing is very outside of the target, right? It's very optional, but I think probably the most archetypal thing that we can say, the closest to the center of the bullseye of all the things I just said, the most important thing about a table is that you put things on it, of all of the things that I just mentioned. Similarly, whether you're talking about a genre or a style, they are categories made up of certain ingredients which mean that the human mind perceives whatever it's hearing as being in that category or not. And this flexibility of categories is why you get purists and non-purists arguing about what is or isn't various different types of music. So essentially, a genre is a category made up of elements, some of which are closer to the center of the bullseye, some of which are further away from the center of the bullseye. But that category has been, in scare quotes, decided by millions of people, thousands, millions of people. It's almost like an unwritten agreement that many, many, many people have decided upon. Whereas a style is the same thing. It's exactly the same thing as a genre, but it's a category that you, as the artist, decide upon. So it has the same structure. In other words, there are certain elements, certain musical elements, which are always in your music. There are other musical elements which are often in your music. There are other musical elements which are sometimes in your music. There are other musical elements which are occasionally in your music, others which are rarely in your music, and then there are others which are never in your music. That constellation of musical elements are your style. Because then when the human ear hears that combination of elements, it can then say, oh, I know who that is. That's Mike Monday, or that's whoever. That's Sampha. That's Burial. That's Wise Blood. Yeah? And this is how you will have certain artists who can make music in almost any genre and still sound like them. Because the elements which make up their style are over and above the elements that you perceive as being in a genre. So in other words, if Burial makes house music, which he actually did once when he did an EP with, I think it was Fortet. And it was funny, they made this house track and it sounded more like Burial than it did house. But that's because the Burial elements were much more kind of essential to the music. They were kind of stronger than the genre. Now, singers have a jump here on instrumental musicians because just by its very nature, the human voice is unique. But one of the things that I'm doing when I'm singing, when I'm practicing my singing, is I'm attempting to use exactly the same process, my unique style process, with my voice to determine, to figure out, to move towards something which is identifiably me. I mean, I think some people automatically have it in the quality of their voice. And other people, I think, are less just automatically unique. I think I'm one of those people. I'm in that category. I'm less automatically unique. Because I think some people might say, well, isn't unique music just something that develops? You just are either given or something that just happens? Well, yes, that is true of some people, but you can also intentionally move towards it by making certain choices and practicing certain things, by taking this approach that I'm talking about here to say, okay, I'm actually not going to do that. I'm not going to sing like that. I'm not going to use that particular type of lyric. I'm not going to use that structure of tune. I'm not going to use that type of bass sound. Not because it's bad, but simply because it's taking me away from something that is unique. So for example, one of the things that I do is out of all of the things that I'm inspired by, out of all of the music that I am inspired by, I look for gaps. I look for, okay, who hasn't done what? So for example, when I started singing a couple of years ago on my music, the people that I was really listening to and learning from were people like Tom York and James Blake. I've actually shifted my focus recently to female singers. People like Kate Bush, Tori Amos, Lana Del Rey, Billie Eilish, because I can't think of any male singers who sing like them. I mean, there probably are there. There's almost always an example of something, right? But I can't think of any male singers that I know of that sing in that way. And I think it would be interesting to do that. Another thing, I'm very influenced by rappers. The way that rappers rhyme and the way that they use language and the wordplay that they use, I'm very excited and interested in that. And that's something that I'm doing as well. Because what I'm doing is taking certain elements and ingredients from unusual places and putting them together in a different way. That is another essential element of what makes unique music, is taking things from different places, putting them together in a different way, and then what you get is something that's unique, but which comes from inspiration. Because doing this generically is actually taking all of the ingredients, all of the elements, and putting them together in the same way. Yes, there may be different notes, there might be slightly different rhythms, there might be slightly different words, but it's essentially the same thing in terms of genre, in terms of style. So to bring this full circle, the reason that you can't get an AI generator to make the music of Sampha without using the word Sampha is because he's done exactly this. He may not have done it consciously, but he has done it, which is take elements from various different areas and put them together in a different way to create something that only he makes. Go and listen to his albums, Process and Lahai. They are singular in the way that they sound, and it's not just because of his voice, although that comes into it as well. And this is what I'm attempting to do with my albums. It started a couple of albums ago, it continued with the last one, and it's certainly happening with this one. And it's something that you can do as well. In fact, I believe now with the advent of AI music generators, it's something that you have to do if you want to remain relevant. So what I'm going to do next is go into more detail about exactly how you can do this, what the steps are that you need to take in order to be able to develop this unique style. And bear in mind that this is something that is going to be ongoing. You're not going to, even I am not going to get to my unique style at the end of this album. It's simply going to be another step on my journey into my unique style. In fact, I believe that is the life, the journey of an artist, to be progressively moving into a unique style and moving away from what they were doing before. So watch out for the next podcasts coming, and also there'll be a few blog posts and emails I'm writing as well. And so with all that said, I'm going to stop talking about making my unique style and start making it.